Hi there. So, a few, weeks ago at this point, I received my awesome copy of the Strongholds and Followers PDF that was put together by the incomparable Matthew Colville and the fine people at MCDM. I'm not going to show you all the crazy content from that because you probably didn't pay for it, but if you didn't, you should. And one of the things you can go right over to I think mcdm.com is where they are selling this thing now. But one of the things that I started thinking almost immediately is I would like to create a campaign just to make good use of these rules because these rules are a cool addition to just about any campaign, especially if your players are into the idea of creating strongholds and creating, gathering followers to themselves, engaging in warfare and that sort of thing. But I thought, well, wouldn't it be great though if you just built the campaign so that this was already a presumed chunk of it? So I thought about how to do that for I don't know all of about 10 minutes. And then I went into this folder called Fife and I created a thing called actually I just created a folder called Strongholds and Followers, but that's I have since changed the name of it. Um, the Fife is a gaming world that I run in, which I have written, and I wrote up this little pitch sheet for a game set in the Malachite kingdoms um, called Breath and Betrayal. I may change the name of that later. I have changed the name of everything so far. But as you can see here, uh, the idea is that in the distant past in Fife, there was a cataclysmic event which the Malachite kingdoms survived largely intact. The bulk of the game here is going to be about winning the favor of the emperor, a la L5R. It is going to be about siding with various factions, acquiring titles and land, possibly marrying and creating heirs. So, very birthright in its conception. The idea being that the PCs will be adventurers first and foremost, and that in their earlier levels they will continue to do those things. And then later on in the game, they will probably do most of their adventuring either by proxy or they will do a lot of their adventuring via court intrigue. I haven't decided yet whether I want to fiddle at all with the mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons a la social interactions, but I think I may. Um, I'm not there yet. And then this is basically the pitch sheet for this game. For those of you who have not ever seen one of these before, this is yet another thing that Matt Colville threw out there. The idea being, you know, you sort of explain what your game looks like, how tactical it is, how much role play there is, how much politics there is, how lethal your game is in this particular situation. But the most important part here is this chunk here, the player buy-in. This is what the players themselves have to be into. This is what has to sound fun to them in order for this game to work. In this particular instance, they need to want to be a part of the politics, the power and influence play, the idea of making a name for themselves and amassing land and troops and possibly heirs and all that other stuff. That has to sound good. And if they're not into that, they're not into this game. Uh, and it's okay if they're not, because I also have this mega dungeon that I am creating for my next campaign that has all kinds of. It is very deeply inspired by the Angry DM's series on mega dungeon creation, whereas his mega dungeon is about a 1 through 12 dungeon. Mine is straight up old school 1 through 20, in the vein of Night Below or Castle Greyhawk. But I kind of want to outline this process for, I almost said you guys. Nobody's watching this right now, but at some point in time in the future, somebody may be watching it. So I kind of wanted to outline this process for whoever you are that may be watching this thing in the future, in the distant future, possibly of the year 2019, 20. It doesn't matter. Um, Beyond that, I don't predict that there will be a functioning civilization. It'll just be a bunch of people playing Dungeons and Dragons in exchange for water chits. So, um, but I do want to show you what I sorted out. So I run my game, as I said, in the world of Fife. It looks like this. That's really small, so let's zoom in on that a little bit and get a better look. When I first created Fife, it was called Allvale in the Waste, and it was just this chunk right here. And as you can see, this bit down here, this is the bit I called Allville, and this bit up here is called the Waste. And all I knew about it at the start was that this was a noble kingdom with a dead king, and this place was awful. I started the game in Allville. It turned out really nice. And then later on, somebody wanted me to run a game in the Wastes, which if you live in the Wastes, they don't call it the Wastes because who would do that? They call it the Blessed Lands, and it is a, I don't know, maybe a Ravenloft style evil kingdom. And sort of this whole area, like I want to say this chunk all the way through these loopy islands and everything down there, that's all the Malachite kingdoms. It's a big kingdom, as evidenced by the fact that it is a pretty substantial chunk of the world. This isn't a huge planet, but I would say that the Malachite kingdoms are, the size of, I don't know, Canada, if we include some of the water there. So it's pretty sizable. This is pretty much all I know about it. I haven't gone into great detail about the place. I know it has an emperor because I wrote it down in a little fiddly note somewhere. That's what I know about the Malachite kingdom. That's what I knew about the Malachite kingdoms before I began. And as you can see from this history document, yes, not much else written. So, but what I did do was I went through and I made a map based, of course, on this map here. I just recreated this in Incarnate. This is a much bigger, more detailed version, and this is the really, but by the way, save often. I don't care that I haven't done anything, just never stop saving in Incarnate, because Incarnate is like, it's like a Zelda game. You can find yourself 6-8 hours into it, and suddenly you're like, have I ever saved? I don't know. And then a stray click of the mouse can destroy all the work you've done. So definitely, I strongly recommend saving here often. So what I'm thinking is, I want to start with some language groups. Just like in the real world, language and culture often go hand in hand here. And I don't really play with just common, especially not in a game that is going to be about courtly intrigue and politics and is all going to take place in one location. I want to have a couple of primary languages. Now, this is mostly a human kingdom. The other thing I currently know about the Malachite kingdoms is that there are monasteries there, and at least one of them recently taught an ogre. She also showed up in a game at some point in time a while back. She was the Master of Falling Rocks and was defeated by our Tiefling monk, who is now the Master of Falling Rocks. So I am probably going to place that monastery up here somewhere. So maybe that tells us there's mountains over here. And I believe if we look at the map, oh, look, the map kind of makes it look like there are mountains here. So we'll place it down there somewhere. So that's where we are. So my thought was, let's take a look at some languages and just go from there. So linguistically, and all of this is really boring stuff, and all of this is just to show you sort of how I prep a campaign. Most of this is never going to come up, but it's stuff that I like to know. So vulgarlang.com is really cool. You can go on there and create languages. I think they have a free access, but you can also, pay something like $14 for lifetime professional, backstage passes access to it, which I did, not necessarily because I need it, but because it is a great tool and you want to support that kind of thing. So when you create a language, it gives you this phrase here, and he stood holding his hat and turned his wet face to the wind, which I presume is from something that I'm unfamiliar with. And then depending on the language that you're in, it will give you the writing of that, the anglicized writing, the pronunciation guide, and then the word order, which is how this is actually sort of said in the language. Because as many of you, I hope, know, word order is not always the same from language to language. So for example, this first language here I created is called Klitu, and that word order is, and his hat holding, stood, and the wind to his wet face turned. So it's sort of putting the sentences in almost Yodified order there. This second language, Ling, is about the same, and this third language, where's my word order here? And he stood, his hat holding, and his wet face turned the wind to, putting the articles at the end of the phrases, which I think is really fascinating. The idea is that the Malachite kingdoms are sort of an Asian kingdoms analog, but I don't want to make this Oriental adventures. This isn't going to be some sort of a wonky, racist stereotype. It is inspired by those sorts of kingdoms, specifically, sort of feudal Japan and dynastic China. But I also see a lot of Thailand in here, and I really later on I'm going to dig into the histories of those places, the cultures, just for my own purposes, to make sure that I am not painting this with too broad a brush. When you build a fantasy kingdom, a game, a fantasy world, you have to paint with a slightly broad brush, or else the cultures that you lay down don't make any sense, right? If there were elves in the real world, they would be as varied as humans, and the only difference between elves and humans would be lifespan and ear pointiness. But in a fantasy world, you want some cultural differences. You want more so than what exists amongst humans. So I think the first step here, because I run a sort of human-centric game, is to create human cultures, and then the next step is to insert other sort of species. The way that goes. As far as species go, we are definitely going to have some elves there. We are probably going to have some dwarves there. And my initial thought, and this may not pan out later, but my initial thought is to have the sort of mountain dwarves, the deep stone dwarves, as not part of the Malachite kingdoms, and to have them be sort of a rebel race that lives below ground, and to have the hill dwarves kind of be their wayward cousins who serve the emperor and live on the surface. But I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that yet. Obviously, we know that there are ogres because I have already said so. And I feel like anytime there's ogres, that also implies orcs and goblins. But there's a lot of orcs up north, so I think I may just go ogres and goblins and see how that pans out. In this particular setting, both tiefling and dragonborn are not they're not born so much as they are created using magic and other various sundry things, dragon eggs specifically. So they're hatched. And so I think I pick one of those, maybe two of those, and have them be created for specific purposes by the emperor, or perhaps by a specific house. We'll see how it plays out. As far as other races go, anywhere there's humans, there's halflings. As far as I'm concerned, gnomes are extraordinarily rare in this world, and this is not one of the places they live, so no gnomes. Am I forgetting any races there? I mean, half elves, but that kind of goes without saying. I think that's all of them. But if we remember one later, then I'll just dig into it. So you can see right here we have this sentence translated into Klitu. This is Vogerlang does all this and then some. Down here they give you the pronunciation for this specific item, and you'll see some of these like this curly QN and other stuff like this, the little tick marks. This rounded R, which is a R instead of a R, which is what this is a rolled R down here, right? So the iltrup, right? And this is a krum. This is almost never going to matter in game, but I like having a feel for the language, right? So let's say this here. We got this krum, mra, akrik, nu, iltrinvul, tradenmar, nope, trifrantrar, krum, nuarta, pmra, iltrup, mrio, trim. That works for me. Now, that is a great sounding language. To me, that kind of sounds, I don't know, And that sounds a little bit less formal than this other one down here, which is called Ling. Same word order, but different linguistics. Ni min min jat seng te huemp pio ni nelen we mu min yat yui ki weka o. That kind of has like a sort of Cantonese feel to it. So I like the idea of Ling as sort of like a high language, Klitu as sort of a low language, and this down here, this Sompuf, this almost has like a rough guttural kind of sound to it. Uh, this is like a ja stefe jak stove e oop jis ja, and so on and so forth. That sounds rougher. That sounds like maybe a dirtier tongue, maybe something that is spoken by very low class people, a servant caste if we have something like that. And so that gives me a starting point, right? So now I can go look at this map and I can create something. Since the Malachite kingdoms, there are many kingdoms, so I can, for example, hit this thing with a paintbrush and I can create a linguistic map. I think this is the root of the Malachite kingdoms. Does that sound right? I like the idea that the mainland here is the source of their power, even though I think I may later on decide that the emperor lives here. But we can, at the very least, we can come through here, we can color this sort of area in and say, all right, this maybe here. I might change this later, but this for now is where people speak. What is this? Ling. And then we can come back over here, grab a different color. Let's grab this red for, what is it? T2. And we can say, all right, well, maybe this here, this island, and these islands here, people speak the Klitu. And then I kind of like the idea that these other island kingdoms out here are where this other language is from. And this is just a wash, right? And over here, who cares? Um, whatever language people used to speak over here has been displaced by these original languages of the kingdoms. But what this tells us is that this is the culture that spawned the Ling language. These are the people that spawned the Klitu language. These are the people in these islands that spawned the, what is that, Sompef language. So now we know something about them culturally. We don't yet, but we will. And so that is sort of, I kind of like the idea that we've got this one island here where the languages are warring, probably the cultures are warring, and I'm sure I'll have more of that as I think about it later. But now this map tells us something. So what is the next step? For the record, here's some other stuff that you get out of this. Like if you grab this vulgar lang, this is my Klitu dictionary, and vulgar lang creates this Klitu dictionary when you create the language. If you have the free version, I think it gives you like 200 words. But the paid version, I have 3,929 words. And I don't have every word I could possibly want, but I have a lot of words. I can probably translate a substantial amount of the English language with just this. And that is something. That's something. Of course, right now it's alphabetical by Klitu, but I can sort by English because it's a spreadsheet. All right. So that is the starting point. I have nothing but that right now. We do have a history document, so I'm gonna make a couple of notes here real quick. I do want to keep this video fairly short, but what I'm going to do is put a few notes down here about culture, stuff like that, and then I'm going to hammer out a lot more details about the ancient cultures of this place and sort of dump that all into a blog post that will contain this video. So we have the Ling people, doodly-doo. We have the how's that spelled? TT. We have the Kletu people. And we have, I'm not even going to try, the Sompof people. So what do we know about them? We don't know anything about them, of course, but I can come up with something. So one thing that we had said was that the Ling language sounds more formal. So we know this is a formal culture. We know that it is structured and hierarchical, and because it is pushing its language out other places, we also know that it is probably militant and aggressive, at least, or it was. So we'll start with that. The Kletu people, I think, sounded a little bit lower, a little bit more of a commonish kind of tongue, and that's probably going to be the common tongue in this region. So when you write common on your character sheet, that will be Kletu. And if you take like a noble background or something, then you'll have Ling as a linguistic option. I think I might also, allow for anybody who has any sort of education. So anybody who has any sort of background in, arcana or history or anything like that. And then the Sompef, this seems to me like a low language, and I think I'm thinking about maybe other races. So maybe this is maybe an ogrish or a goblinish tongue, that kind of thing, or a tongue that they share in common with those people. So that seems like a good starting point. So the Kletu people then would have been a more common folk, right? Family oriented, maybe agrarian. Did I spell agrarian right? Only one way to find out. Google says yes. An agrarian folk. Wait, do I know what agrarian means? It means farming, right? Relating to cultivated land and the cultivation of land. Yeah, farming. Okay, good. I nailed it. Never hurts to check, though. And then what do we know about the Sompef people? Let's call them rough. Let's call them. I don't want to go straight into like a. I don't want it to be like, how now brown cow. I don't want them to be mindless barbarian types. That doesn't really appeal to me. But they are mountain people. Some of them. So I may have to move where some of this stuff comes from, or at least move where the mountain. You know what? Those islands, they're island people because those islands are volcanic. So and that means that they are also fishing folk, as well as sailing folk. So sort of a mountainous barbarian style Polynesian people kind of blend. That might be really interesting. Conan meets Moana. That'd be a nightmare. Conan meets Moana. Steal that chicken right out from under her. All right. So that is a good starting point. So I think what I'm going to do now is sort out things like cultural mores and faiths and whatnot. I am still debating religion in the Malachite kingdoms as to whether people worship the emperor as a god or whether they have their own gods. Fife is not a place that has a lot of gods, and practically speaking, that makes sense because there are not gods in the cosmology. Each one of those sort of planes has a being that rules over it. but that being is not a god. It's not interested in your faith. Um, the realms of fire and light and law and chaos and all that. Um, in fact, this entire setting, it's worth mentioning, was sort of a callback to first edition Dungeons and Dragons. The idea being that law and chaos is sort of the primary conflict in the world. So there is no, you'll note a distinct lack of good and evil realms or planes here. They don't exist. Good and evil are still parts of the alignment chart, but they are concepts that are strictly mortal. If you were if you're a fire elemental or like a demonic being from the realms of chaos, the idea of good and evil is laughable to you. It doesn't make any sense. You don't have that moral constraint. Humans and other sentient species, they have those moral constraints, and they see things as good and evil. And of course, things are good and evil. Those are relativistic but fairly real concepts, as real as they are in our world. Um, but they aren't cosmic constants the way you would see them in many places. This is sort of an order versus chaos place, and I have the feeling that the Malachite kingdoms lean very heavily towards this law and order side of things. And what we are going to see is that a lot of the lesser factions, a lot of the oppressed folks, um, are on this chaos end of the spectrum, seeking freedom, liberation. So we're probably looking at a fairly totalitarian government here, which is okay by me because that makes for good story. All right, I'm going to call that there. I'm going to go back here, sort out some more history and cultural stuff, and you guys will hopefully see that on the blog. Ciao.